Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the Cram Podcast. I see dead people. Remember that line? If you're old enough, you might remember it from a very popular movie. It was called The Sixth Sense. It was about the paranormal. But that line, I see dead people, is actually something real, something true. It's an experience many people go through when they are dying. It's a phenomenon that Dr. Christopher Kerr has been studying. He's documented more than 1,500 end-of-life events to try and answer questions about what we experience and what these experiences mean to us as we are dying. Dr. Kerr is a palliative care researcher. He's a Canadian who lives and works in New York State as the Chief Executive Officer and Medical Officer of Hospice and Palliative Care of Buffalo. He's also a physician. Thanks very much for joining us, Dr. Kerr.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Now, you've said that you didn't choose to study this experience, that it's something that has followed you throughout your life, ever since your experience with your father. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I was 12 when my father died. And the last time I saw him, he was reaching for me, and he was trying to fix the buttons on my shirt and told me that we had to hurry to get a plane, that we were going to go fishing, which was something that we did every year. And he was clearly comfortable and looked actually joyful. And I didn't understand it, but I knew wherever he was, it was a good place. And that's the last time I ever saw him. And I would go on like he was to be a physician, and was really on the acute side of medicine in hospitals and in cardiology, and just moonlighting at hospice. And it wasn't hospice care, end of life care wasn't something I was particularly trained to do well. But I wasn't here very long, and I saw again what I had seen in childhood: people who were dying, who were seeing people who were loved and lost, but again, almost universally very comforted.
So why did seeing that experience again with people who were dying, why did that impact you so much?
As a boy, it was something that had stuck with me, obviously. I didn't really talk about it, but the last time you see somebody you love, you're imprinted. I didn't understand it. I didn't know its source. But I knew as a 12-year-old boy intuitively that they were okay. He was okay. And then as a physician, I was something that had never left me. I'm seeing again, and again. And there was something universal in the experience of dying that seemed to be pretty evident. And again, not understanding it, but more having some reverence for the fact that it was occurring and it had meaning.
Mm-hmm.
So,
was this, I mean, you went through medical school. Was this something that was talked about at all?
No. Medical school is really training to defy or the death, and when it can't be defied, almost denied. When I trained, actually, when somebody was dying and there was no longer things to do to them diagnostically or for treatment, they came off our service. We never paused just to be present or to learn how to be comforters by having presence. We kind of trained under the motto, there's nothing more we can do for you, which really meant there's nothing more we can do to you. So it was when I came to hospice and I had nothing around me technologically, and there was no acts of doing that I was forced to be present and see again, open my eyes to what I had seen as a child. And it was really my colleagues in nursing and social work and pastoral care for whom this is just something they know in their bones. It was them telling me. So that's how that worked.
Yeah. And then why did you want to make this an area of research, an area of focus for you?
I actually didn't. It's an interesting story. It didn't grow out of some great ambition. I was frustrated, angry actually, because I was teaching a lot and trying to teach the young doctor that this stuff mattered. And we live in such an evidence-based time. They would say, "Well, there's no evidence for that." Was always the reply, or that the patient was confused. And of course, it's always been talked about in the humanities, but there really wasn't a lot. There was anecdotal case reports, but no real evidence. So we did the evidence really to present as valid to a medical community that really wasn't prepared to listen.
Mm. I want to play a clip now. So you recorded these interviews with people, both video and audio, and I want to play a clip of a patient named Jeannie. And this interview occurred 5 days before she died.
I was laying in bed, and people were walking very slowly by me. The right-hand side, I didn't know, but they were all very friendly, and they touched my arm or my hand when they went by. But the other side were people that I knew. My mom and dad were there, my uncle. Everybody I knew that was dead was there.
You know what struck me about Jeannie? Well, first of all, she seems perfectly lucid, not confused at all, and very clear about what she saw. She's very matter of fact.
Mm. Yeah, so to participate in our study, you had to be screened for confusion, or you couldn't participate. So yeah, and then one of the reasons we film them, because we make assumptions about dying patients, and it was very important to put imagery to it because they look and sound like somebody who obviously has full capacity. She has actually heightened acuity. They are matter of fact. You don't sense any fear or apprehension around these events. They're described, unlike dreams, there's no metaphor. They just kind of are factual, and they don't need translation. If you're seeing your mom and dad, that's just is what it is. When we ask them to measure realism on a 1 to 10 scale, 10 being the most real, it's usually 10. So it feels very virtual. There's very little said between the dreamer and the people in the dream, but everything seems to be understood. So it's very classic.
Yeah. So when you say they rated a 10 as far as how real it is, what is it they call it? Like when they say they see these dead people, is it just like I see you? Or is it a vision they have? Or, do they say they're dreaming? Or what do they say?
Well, it's a great question. So they often get very clear when they reject the notion that it's a dream. So you'll say, "Did you have a dream?" No, it wasn't a dream. What we often hear is that they'll say things like, "I don't normally dream," or "I don't remember my dream." So they're described as actually a real event to them.
And you said it's comforting. Are these dreams usually positive, or can they be negative as well?
80%, 88% are positive. And the degree of positivity increases as they approach death. So the frequency increases and the content changes. So as you get closer to death, you're more likely to see people who you've known and who you've lost. When we measured comfort relative to content, seeing the deceased was associated with the greatest level of comfort.
I want to play another example. I'm going to play a clip of Paul, and this was taken 3 weeks before he died.
Yep.
I probably had 15 dreams about her, maybe, somewhere in there. She always wears, I dream in color most times, and she always wears a beautiful light blue. It could be a suit, it could be a gown, it could be a dress, but it's always light blue. And a couple of times she's gave me the little beauty pageant wave, and a couple of times she sort of always with a smile. Only one or twice I've ever heard her voice, but she always kind of lets me know that she's fine. I get that feeling after a dream like that.
So Paul's talking about his wife, and And it's interesting. Jeannie was talking about people on one side of her and she didn't know them. Is it common usually to see people who've died who you know or that you don't know?
Oh, no, she also saw her parents.
Yes. Yeah.
And what she goes on to say in the video is very interesting. I know I'm not dying yet because I haven't seen my dog. And she ended up seeing her dog. Yeah, what happens mostly is that you see people who you've known and who you've lost. And it tends to center on, there's this editing process where it tends to center most on people who loved you unconditionally, who truly secured you. So it may be one parent, not another, two spouses, but not the third. But it seems to be very, very selective. So the people who harmed, withheld love, they're just, you don't see those more negatively based or compromised relationships. Those aren't as prevalent.
Not as bad. What about regrets, though? Do patients ever express regrets through these visions?
No, but what they do, about 12% have dreams that they clicked off as discomforting. But some of the discomforting dreams, what we got wrong was we assumed that discomforting meant negative and without value. And actually, some of those were the most meaningful dreams of all, in that they were transformative. So people die as you live. And end-of-life experiences such as these don't deny the life that was led. And we've all been harmed in one way. We've experienced loss and regret and sorrow. And those themes aren't denied, but they often bring about a change in perspective.
For the dying person?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Are they coming to terms with something?
Yeah, and it's fascinating that they could have carried this burden for 6-7 decades, and there seems to be some resolution at the end. So there's examples of war veterans who had survivor's guilt and PTSD for decades. And at the end of their life, their comrades come to them and tell them, "We're coming for you, and you'll be okay." A mother whose child was in jail and her identity as a mother is in question, and her parents come to her and tell her she was a good mother. So whatever that lesion seems to be, it could be a loss, it could be an act. It seems to be there seems to be some sort of addressing of that.
You were saying that these visions increase as a person nears death.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just thinking, because you've now spoken to, over 1,500 patients, are you able to determine the time of death?
Yeah. There's certainly an indicator. It's suggestive of kind of things. So that's actually what led to one of the things that led to the first project, because the nurses were able to prognosticate better than I could. So when they saw somebody who was clearly dreaming of the deceased, they viewed that as part of their clinical assessment and used it prognostically. And so I was more than skeptical. But what we did in our studies is we would ask everybody a standardized interview or questionnaire every day. So we were looking at change over time. And there was this dramatic increase in frequency and specifically of seeing the dead. So that was prognostic.
So what is the timeline then?
It's usually these events start about 2 weeks before death. And again, they increase in frequency.
About 2 weeks before death.
Yeah, we've even had people who came in, they may have been dying for something, and they were treated with an antibiotic, and they start to go and recover a bit, and the dreams go away.
So do you know what's going on physically?
Not a clue.
Not a clue.
I gave up a long time ago trying to understand this. I can tell you what it's not. It certainly isn't drugs. Many of our patients aren't on anything that is any psychoactive effects or neurobiologic effect. Many of them are on the same drugs, so some aren't on any. They often have diseases that have absolutely no consequence to brain function. They could have a soft tissue tumor of a leg or something. There's no, you know what I mean? It's not, these are people who are high function. Many are living alone. They can do their taxes. They're cognitively intact. So I don't think this can be explained neurobiologically in terms of a disease or pharmacologic process. It makes sense to me that, we know this when people are faced with terminality, it draws you inward, right? It's a very different vantage point. You're going to be reflective. You're going to reflect on life and what mattered most, and that tends to be our relationships. These processes, though, tend to reunite us with people who we've loved in a way that almost puts us back together towards the end. And I think that's probably the most fascinating thing is that they don't speak of fear.
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, these processes really just affirm the life that was led. They don't deny death. These aren't death denying, and they're not like near death experiences where people are given these great epiphanies and pronouncements. That doesn't occur. This is you're more likely, instead of seeing tunnels and lights and given instructions, you're more likely to be sitting around the kitchen table with the family you've loved and lost. That's what it's about. It's about the common, everyday interactions that have given our life its greatest meaning. And that's what it seems to be about.
There is something beautiful about this.
Very
There really
much.
is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, do you think it's possibly the body's way of preparing us for death, for allowing acceptance of death?
I don't know if it's the body's way. I think it's the soul's way.
Do you believe in a soul?
I, I've approached this work. We were very, very disciplined that we were not looking through this process of dying as a keyhole into the afterlife, the paranormal, or the religious. We were just looking at dying as a mystery unto itself. I think where I end up is that there's certainly this better story that people don't leave us feeling alone. They feel connected again to what really mattered most to them. The source of that, I can't begin to imagine. What I also have learned to appreciate is that while the body may be physically changing and decaying in a way, paradoxically, your mind or your soul or psychologically, spiritually, you're going through this very enriching process. So because you're dying physically doesn't mean you stop living. And profound living seems to occur in the final days of life. We did a study where we looked at post-traumatic growth, whether there could be positive psychologic gains within a otherwise perceived negative experience like dying. And these people were growing and adapting and having insight right up into the last days of life. So it's not just this passive process. There really is some inner work that seems to go on. It doesn't seem to be religiously based. It seems to be rooted in the life that you led, which kind of makes
That's
sense.
interesting. Yeah. So did you also screen for that? Whether people who were having these visions were religious or not religious?
Yeah. The problem with all that sort of work, though, is there's a lot of misrepresentation. So unless you go really deep, so people will say, yes, I'm Catholic, but they may have been baptized and whatever, but they actually don't practice or believe. So it's very hard to get to the truth of that. But we didn't see a difference, whether you were religious or not. And religious iconery or themes are actually very rare. And other people have found the same thing.
And what about gender, culture? What about those factors?
Our window into the culture distinctions is pretty limited. They tend to be predominantly white. But what we do know is in other cultures, that this is deeply embedded, particularly in the indigenous world, that it's a big part of their connectivity to their ancestors. And we're involved in a documentary now that involves groups in the Australian outback and the Amazon for whom this is rich and pretty unfiltered and readily accepted and actually expected. And in a way, they don't fear death because this is so rooted in their belief system. It's really quite remarkable. I think what's happened is that as in the Western world, as we've medicalized dying, the science has kind of obscured the art and made it less of what it really is, which is a very human experience and a closing of a life. Here, it's more likely to be about organ failures and hospitals than it is life closure.
I want to play one more clip. And this one is from the perspective of someone who's supporting a loved one who's dying. This is Jennifer.
Yeah.
This would be the Sunday before he passed. He woke up in the morning and I couldn't get him to eat. He wasn't hungry, total loss of appetite. And I'm like, baby, we got to make you something for breakfast. What do you want? He goes, I'm full. I said, Pat, you had a snack pack pudding yesterday. You're not full. And he's like, oh, no, I ate with Nana Dolores last night. As real as I'm sitting here, he believed he made sauce with his grandmother the night before, said he could smell it, he could still taste it, he was full from it. And she showed him, after all these years, what he had done wrong, which is the very last step before you take it off the burner was to add a teaspoon of sugar. It was so very real for him, to the point, there I am, putting on sweatpants, driving to the grocery store, because we spent the next 7.5 hours, because that's how long it takes, making his grandmother's sauce that day. So, and he was so sick, and it was the only day I was ever allowed to help him.
Chris, what do you make of that?
It's wonderful. So it's pretty common. So first of all, it was virtual for him. It was lived to the point that he actually felt fullness. So it was deeply experiential. He was being put back together. He was reacquainted at a very proximate level with somebody who he loved. And he was able to balance two worlds, which I think is beautiful. He was able to relate his experience, but all these patients say the same. They say it in a very matter-of-fact way. It's not, and I've yet to have a patient to ask me to decipher it or what do you think this means? It's just an occurrence. I think what's also fascinating is what it means for her, because she'd seen death not as something empty and devoid of value or meaning, but instead she's seen him surrounded in love and comfort. And that's going to change how she processes death. And we've done studies on that with hundreds of bereaved family members. And it makes an enormous difference, again, how people leave us. And they feel a connectivity because they're seeing their loved one connected to somebody who they loved. And so they don't seem alone.
Oh, so when you spoke to family and friends, they generally felt comforted as well?
Yeah, we actually used a tool to measure bereavement processing, and the folks who witnessed this bereaved differently in ways that were healthier. They were able to remember and recall in ways that made them comfortable rather than less empty or full of regret. Yeah, very much so.
How has all this changed your view of palliative care?
Oh, I think it's only strengthened it in the sense that it has to come out. Palliative care, I think, is an antidote to the doctor's death, an institutional, medicalized death. I don't think this necessarily dying belongs to the domain of medicine. I think this leaves open the door for input for multiple caring professionals, nurses and social workers and pastoral care. I think it humanizes dying in a way that matters. The dying don't die differently or feel an organ that's failing. They feel a life that's closing. And I think that all reinforces palliative care, which looks at the patient in totality in consideration of their life and their loved ones. And I think that's the approach, obviously, that's more human, more compassionate, and more dignified.
This makes me think as well, and I'm not sure if this is connected to having these kinds of visions, but I think about the stories and even lies that we tell ourselves throughout our life. And I wonder if there are these truths that are buried within us that maybe we have to deal with at the end of life. I don't know if that comes out at all.
Yeah, and that's very well put. What always moves me, and this is hard to describe unless you're there, is the core elements of having lived, the truths of having lived, do seem to surface in vividness at the end. So I'm always struck when you have somebody who may be in their 9th decade of life and they lost a parent when they were a child. But all over again, they can smell a perfume or hear a voice or a touch, that it was there all along. And we know memory is rekindled and brought forth in a variety of ways. For example, you hear an old song from high
Yes.
school, and all of a sudden you can recall. And we see this all the time, people who are cognitively different, who are demented, for example. They have personhood and emotional histories that come to surface under the right stimulus. And I think that's what happens in dying. I think it accesses parts of our past that come through in a very unfiltered and tangible way so that they're felt. And they're felt to the point that not only are they real, but they're detailed and they have an effect.
Have you witnessed that? Because I also think about, do people say things, and I guess they're truths, which even they didn't consciously know. But
Oh yeah,
yeah,
yeah. There's details of past lives that often shock the family members. So I had somebody not long ago who was dying, and people who are dying often reverse to their native language. Again, the formative elements of life are those ones that seem to be most accessible. So we're going back, and they were speaking in their native Polish, and they were recalling rich detail of childhood friends, of grandparents, of pets they had. And again, those things were more proximate than anything more recent. And it's really wonderful because it's often the best parts of living. So less about illness and recent happenings. People aren't talking about bills they have to pay or regrets they have. They're feeling again what mattered and what helped form them, what mattered to them at the most.
I'm not sure why, because I don't think I'm near death, or at least I could be, but I don't know of it. But I feel oddly comforted by this.
Yeah. The overarching theme is amazingly positive.
Mm.
And again, it's not denying. What I think so is not denying death. So it's not, nobody's
No.
being deluded. It's more like in affirming life, the fear of death seems to dissipate because what's gone isn't really gone. It's there for you. Like that gentleman, re-experiencing his grandmother. She was probably most tangible to him in his dying days.
Mm-hmm.
So the refamiliar become familiar again, and that is very comforting.
Has it changed your own view of death?
Yeah, I've had cancer, and so you think of death. I'm as fearful of dying as anybody else, mostly because people are. I have a dependent life. I have children, so it's not like I would welcome dying, but the actual the fear of the process I don't fear it in the same way. That's not my experience, you know. I mean, we certainly see patients who are, I would say, unmanaged, often tragically coming from hospitals. But when people are managed, we see comfort and peace.
Do you think these interviews and the research that you've done, will it make some headway, do you think, with traditional medicine and the
No.
way you don't?
No. No, we're doing an interesting paper now looking at, we're repeating very old studies that helped argue for palliative care. And it's really an indictment of a medical system that's very fragmented and still curative to the point without necessarily allowing much space for this sort of work. I think where it makes a difference actually is not in the medical community, because I don't think we're doing dying any better in many ways. We have greater awareness of the need for palliative medicine, but in practice, at least in this country, in the United States, it's so fragmented. The role of primary care doctors kind of disappeared. There's so many layers that nobody owns the patient and the trajectory of care in the same way. Where it matters, though, is I think the consumers of healthcare. So I don't think this generation wants the earlier version. They don't want their parents' end of life experience. So they want their love. They want to be home. They want to be surrounded by family and loved ones. They want comfort. They do not want a medicalized end of life experience. So I think that, and there's a cultural openness. That's why we have death cafes, for example, and that sort of. So yeah, I think it matters.
You end one of your talks and you say to the audience, think of your greatest loss, your greatest comfort, your greatest wonder. I love those lines, and I just wondered why you would say that. What are you asking, or what are you thinking about when you say that?
Well, there's what I think personally for myself, but because I think that's what I witness in my patients so often is that if I had to thematically check the boxes, that's kind of where they fall. All the richness of having existed comes out in one of those sort of forms. And that's a very different way to imagine. I'm asking the listener to kind of imagine what I see in our patients, which is that.
Are you going to continue on this research?
Yeah, it's a funny story. You know, we didn't publish it for 10 years because we never thought anyone would care. So then we published it, and you know, we sometimes want to go on to other ways, but it just kind of has this momentum. So we're doing a multinational study right now, and we're looking at some of the spiritual aspects, like what does this do to the person who has experienced in terms of their beliefs. So we're asking, I think, better, deeper questions as we get further into it. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, we certainly look forward to hearing those results.
Thank you.
Too. Thank you so much, Chris. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
It was wonderful. Thank you very much.
That's Dr. Christopher Kerr. He's a physician, a palliative care researcher, and chief executive officer and medical officer of Hospice and Palliative Care of Buffalo in New York State. He's originally from Toronto. If you'd like to know more about his work, please check out our show notes. That's it for this edition of the Cram Podcast. We hope you enjoyed it, and you can follow us on social. Our handle is @CramIdeas. Thanks for watching, and see you back here next time.